From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Well, good afternoon. Welcome to the Library of Congress. I'm John Cole. I'm the director of the library's Center for the Book, and I welcome you to one of our Books and Beyond author talks and signings. Most of these talks are co-sponsored with another division of the Library of Congress, and such is the case today, and we're pleased to have the Manuscript Division as our co-sponsor. The Center for the Book itself was created in 1977 by Daniel Borston when he was Librarian of Congress, and his idea was that the Library of Congress needed a way to reach out to a general audience to promote books and reading. Back in 1977 and 78, literacy wasn't really a current term, believe it or not. Through the years, we've added promotion of literacy and promotion of libraries to our plate. The Center for the Book operates primarily around the country through state affiliates. There's an affiliate in each state, either hosted by a state library or perhaps a public library system. 4 are hosted by universities, and 10 are hosted by state humanities councils. So we have a wonderful reading and literacy promotion network going in all of the states. The Center for the Book also plays a major role in the National Book Festival. This year's festival will be September the 5th. Again, it will be our second year in the Washington Convention Center. We were moved off the mall, actually, and we left reluctantly, but now we've not only adapted, but we love the convention center. The crowds are huge. It's more convenient, more flexible space for us, and there's always that air conditioning and those clean bathrooms. So it's a great place for an event, and I invite you. The other final thing, administratively, we can do it in one full day from 10 to 10 rather than 2 days on the mall. So while we're still patriotic, we're mighty glad to have the new facility. The center has 2 other components in addition to our central office. We are also administrators of the library's Poetry and Literature Center, and in 2009 we were privileged to help establish the Library of Congress's Young Readers Center. So that's a menu all in the name of books, reading, literacy, and library promotion. The Books and Beyond series is really dedicated to showing the value of library resources, not just our library, but especially our library. And we celebrate the publication of new books that either have a special connection with the Library of Congress. Often it is the use of the collections, but sometimes it's a special project, and it allows us to have partnerships with other organizations and other parts of the library that we wouldn't work with otherwise. We also are able to film all of these talks for later viewing on the Library of Congress's website, and over 400 of these talks which have been in existence since 2006, have been filmed and are available on the website. Here's how it works. Our speaker will give us the story behind the book and the story, his hopes for the book. We will have a question and answer period, and then we will have a book signing to start no later than 1 o'clock. Because we're filming and there will be a question and answer period, I need to tell you that if you choose to ask a question, you are giving your permission to perhaps be part of our webcast and part of the record of the Center for the Book's talks. Our speaker is going to be introduced by the Library of Congress's own Walt Whitman specialist, Dr. Alice Burney. Alice has a doctorate in literature from the University of California. She came to the Library of Congress in 1973 and has held her current position as the literary and cultural historian in the Manuscript Division since 1990. Let's welcome Alice Burney.
We are treated today with a return engagement for our speaker. Same venue, but totally new show. 3 years ago, he was here with his Frederick Law Olmsted show, which was developed largely from our collections in Manuscript Division. His latest book, Rebel Souls, Walt Whitman and America's First Bohemians, springs from the same looming Civil War environment and vastly enriches our understanding of mid-19th century New York history. In addition to writing really enjoyable, well-researched page-turners, Mr. Martin's main talent, in my opinion, is his journalist's knack for selecting excellent, neglected subjects that really need to be explored. There have been hundreds of books on Walt Whitman, but the book we celebrate today brings in a whole coterie of his early friends and associates, each one interesting in his or her own right. Although a compilation on Whitman at Pfaff was published last year, no one has written a full group biography in over 150 years of intense Whitmania. Many of us learn here for the first time all about young Whitman's rebellious pals. They included a comedian, a cartoonist, an actor, a psychedelic, and a scantily clad female performer. This is the left bank brought to Old Broadway. The Manuscript Division, as you may know, is the world's largest repository of Whitman primary materials, with some 20,000 items, joining our collection of the papers of 23 early U.S. presidents and those of pioneers in science, law, theater, politics, and civil rights. Currently some 63,000 million items. Excuse me. Justin Martin delved deeply into our Whitman archives, as well as into many other repositories, to find the history of the poet's early social life. Mr. Martin previously published 3 other highly praised biographies: Genius of Place, The Life of Frederick Law Olmsted, 2011, Nader, Crusader, Spoiler, Icon, 2002, and Greenspan, The Man Behind Money, 2000. As one of the few journalists to gain access to Greenspan, Martin produced a best-selling biography of the secretive Fed chairman, selected as a notable book by the New York Times Book Review. Martin's biography of Ralph Nader served as a primary source for the film An Unreasonable Man, an Academy Award-nominated documentary. Justin is a former staff writer at Fortune magazine. His articles have appeared in Newsweek, Money, the San Francisco Chronicle, and other journals. He is a 1987 graduate of Rice University. He lives with his wife and twin sons in Forest Hills Gardens, New York. I'm very pleased to present a truly master biographer, Justin Martin.
Well, thank you for that very nice introduction, Alice. And it's great to be here at the Library of Congress for a return engagement. And it's great to be part of the Books and Beyond series. Now, my latest book, it's called Rebel Souls, and it's the story of Walt Whitman and a group of scruffy artists who hung out at Faff Saloon in New York City during the 1850s. Now, my editor, she likes to call them Walt and the Rowdies, but they're really rightly understood as America's very first Bohemians. And today I'm going to talk about them, and I'm also going to talk about how I made use of the Library of Congress for some of my research. So as good a point of introduction as any, or as good a point of departure as any, is this image right here. And during the 1850s, there was a Brooklyn artist named Gabriel Harrison, and he recently made the transition from painting into what was in the newfangled art of photography. And photography in those days was daguerreotyping. It was a very painstaking and laborious process. Well, one day, in the summer of 1854, he was wandering around Brooklyn, creating images of various colorful local figures. He couldn't find anybody more colorful than Walt Whitman. And Whitman, in turn, he absolutely loved this image. He loved it so much that he used it as the frontispiece the next year for the 1854 first edition of Leaves of Grass. Now, this first edition bears very little similarity to the one that everyone's now familiar with. It's a tall, thin volume. It contains just 12 poems. They are untitled. They float inexplicably one into the next. Nevertheless, and it was also self-published. He printed just 795 copies, and of those he sold very few, and it received very few reviews. What few it received tended to be highly critical. Nevertheless, this was a revolutionary work. Whitman is the acknowledged innovator of free verse, so these poems lack traditional meter and rhyme. And it's also, I should mention at this point, this is, here at the Library of Congress, there are only 200 copies of this book left in existence. There are 795 originally printed, 200 are left in the world. 14 of them are available. 14 of those number are here at the Library of Congress, and this image right here was taken from the Library of Congress's image collection. Now, this particular image, it captures Whitman. He's sort of striking a rebellious pose. He's got his hat tilted at a rakish angle. He wouldn't have used the term Bohemian in 1855, but it really captures him in a Bohemian guise. And now I'll explain where that term came from and how Whitman came to take up with a group of disreputable Bohemian artists. And for that, we need to turn to a man named Henry Clapp, Jr. Now, Clapp was a very well-known lecturer on topics such as temperance and abolitionism in New England during the 1840s. And he often shared the stage with some real luminaries, such as Frederick Douglass and William Lloyd Garrison, the abolitionist firebrand. Well, in 1849, Clapp traveled to Paris for a 3-day World Peace Congress. And when he arrived, the left bank scene was just in full Bohemian flower. Now, Clapp, who to this point had been a teetotaler, he fell off the wagon and threw himself entirely into Parisian-style Bohemia. And now's a good time to explain where that term Bohemian comes from. Now, when Clapp arrived in Paris in 1849, the country of France was just 1 year removed from a failed revolution, and the boulevards were just thrumming with various slogans. Now, and Parisian society was just in an incredible state of tumult. Now, at this time, you had certain people from foreign lands were pouring into Paris, and Parisians, particularly those of a conservative political bent, started calling these foreigners Bohemians on the notion that they must be hailing from the kind of distant, mystical Central European kingdom of Bohemia. We now know that the people who were pouring into France during the 1840s were the Romani people, and they actually originated on the Indian subcontinent about 1,000 years ago. But never mind, the Parisians who used the term Bohemia, they used it pretty indiscriminately, and they used it almost like a slur. And they aimed it at scruffily dressed students. They aimed it, of course, at the Romani people, and they also aimed it at flamboyantly dressed artists. Now, the artists, they appropriated the term Bohemian. They made it their own. Provided such a perfect contrast for Parisian society of that era. You had your bourgeois, cautious, smug, and prosperous, and you had their opposite number, Bohemians. Now, a similar confusion about the origins of the Romani people gave rise to a term that everyone's familiar with, gypsy. This was because Romani people were also pouring into England at about the same time, and it's rooted in the mistaken notion that they must be coming from Egypt. So, Clapp, as I said, he entirely threw himself into this first French Bohemia. And this first French Bohemia was a kind of a codified lifestyle. Its attributes were sort of spelled out. For instance, one of them for the first French Bohemians was a kind of almost a pathological fear of conventionality. Another was an elevation of art above all things. At the same time, many of these first French Bohemians, among them, there was more talk of art than actual creation of art. People would sit around the cafes and talk about how they were going to create a masterpiece, never quite get around to doing it. This first French Bohemia was characterized by sexual openness. There's also many of these people were saddled with substance abuse problems. And many of them died young. The cliche is that they died of tuberculosis brought on by the chilly, damp conditions in the garrets where they lived and worked. Well, Henry Clapp So he said he threw himself entirely into this French Bohemia. He started hanging out in cafes, drinking whiskey, chasing women. He affected a little clay pipe, which was one of the accoutrements of this first French Bohemia. Now, he'd originally intended to stay in Paris just for 3 days for that World Peace Congress. He wound up staying for 3 years. And when he returned to America, he decided not to go back to New England, where he'd made a name for himself as a lecturer on social issues and social topics, but instead to go to New York City, which struck him as a proper and fitting venue for this experiment. Now, one day in 1855, Clapp was wandering along Broadway when he encountered Faff Saloon. And Faff's was at 647 Broadway. It was at the intersection of Broadway and Bleecker Street. It was just north of Bleecker. And I actually marked the building where Faff's once resided with an arrow. However, Faff's was an underground saloon. It was a basement saloon, so it was beneath the building that was marked in the previous slide. And the way you found Faff's was you'd be walking along Broadway, and you'd find the name of the saloon dimly lettered on the wall of that building I showed in the previous slide. Then what you do is you'd open up a hatchway in the Broadway sidewalk. It's almost like opening up the door to a root cellar. Then you descend down a long, narrow steel ladder to the floor of the saloon below. Now, Faff's was a very ample space. It extended the entire length of the building above it. It's also very modestly appointed. There was sawdust sprinkled on the floor. Just a handful of gas lanterns provided the sole illumination. But as soon as he arrived, Clapp instantly recognized that this was the right venue for this experiment in Bohemianism. It just had the right kind of European libertine ambience. Now, Charles Ignatius Pfaff, the proprietor of the saloon, actually arranged to set Clapp up in a room that was separate from the main room of the saloon. And this was a little room with a low vaulted ceiling. He also furnished Clapp with a long table capable of seating 30 people. And you can actually see in this old image, you can see a kind of cartoony version of Clapp looking very cross and cynical and puffing on his trademark pipe. So this little room and this long table were to be the spot, the venue for this collection of Bohemians. Now, there have always been Bohemians throughout the entire history of the world, indeed, if not in name. So Clapp's innovation was he imported this useful term, Bohemian, from France, and he also imported this kind of codified lifestyle with the various attributes spelled out. And his first American Bohemia would very much self-consciously emulate the French Bohemia that came before. And so now I'm going to introduce several members of the cast of characters in my book, working my way ultimately to Walt Whitman. So one of the people that gathered in that little vaulted room at that long table beneath the Broadway pavement was a man named Artemus Ward. And what Artemus Ward did, his act was so revolutionary in its day that no one was even sure what to call it. Newspapers were in the habit of calling it a comic lecture, but he's really best understood as America's very first stand-up comedian. And Abraham Lincoln became a huge fan. In fact, before introducing the Emancipation Proclamation to his collected cabinet, Lincoln first read some passages from an Artemus Ward humor routine. And he said to his cabinet, who were at first bemused and then amused, he said, "Gentlemen, at a time like this, if you didn't laugh, you should cry. You need this medicine as much as I do." Now, Ward was a classic sad clown. And when I learned recently about Robin Williams killing himself, it kind of put me in mind of Artemus Ward. It seems like such an enduring pattern for comedians. They give laughter and levity to the world, but inside they're full of darkness and sadness. And as I learned more about Ward and really all the figures in this circle, I was struck by how passionately and intensely they burned for their art and for their craft. Ward and so many of these others have subsequently fallen into obscurity, but in their time they were just burning for their work. And while I was doing my research, including at the Library of Congress, I'd often have to look at old letters and manuscripts, often from the 1850s, and they often felt, in appearance at least, kind of old-fashioned. But what often shined through is how alive these people were in their day. I started to feel an obligation to revive Artemus Ward and his cohorts and make their stories known to a new group of people in a new century. Now, another person who gathered in that little vaulted room beneath the Broadway pavement at that long table was a woman named Ada Isaacs Minkin. And that fact alone, that she was a woman, is notable. This was a time of real gender segregation in American society. And some of you in the audience today might be familiar with McSorley's Saloon in New York City. Well, McSorley's and Pfaff's are from almost exactly the same time. McSorley's opened in 1854, and Pfaff's opened 1 year later in 1855. And McSorley's original slogan was, "Good food, good ale, no women." So it gives you an idea of the kind of gender segregation that existed in American society in that era. It also tells you something about Faff Saloon that was welcoming to women at a time like this. And it tells you something about Henry Clapp, the man who convened this group of Bohemians, that he wanted to have women as part of his circle. And in fact, a number of women, including Ada Isaacs Minkin, were regulars at that long table. Now, Minkin was an actress, and as I learned more about her, I started to find she was very cunning and also very vulnerable. In my mind, I started to picture almost like a sepia-toned Marilyn Monroe. Now, she gained fame, notoriety really, for her role in a play called Mazeppa. Now, when she started appearing in Mazeppa in the late 1850s, the play had been around for about 30 years, and an entire generation of Americans had come out to see this play, although they'd grown pretty shop-worn. Now, the subject matter of Mazeppa is Balkan geopolitics, which sounds excruciating. But you gotta remember, this was a time before radio, before the internet, before television, and the opportunity to learn about exotic lands and exotic customs had drawn, as I said, an entire generation of Americans out to see this play, although it had grown to be a very tired production. Well, its theatrical producer had an idea about how to freshen up the production. And his idea, it's centered around Minkin and having her play the lead role. Now, Mazeppa is a Tartar warrior. So as you might imagine, the role had always previously been played by a man. But this theatrical producer decided instead that he wanted Minkin to play the lead role in drag, and that, as a woman in drag. So that meant through the very first part of the play, she was engaged in various rousing scenes of swordplay. But then comes the climactic scene, and Mazeppa's enemies tear off his tunic. And at this point, the buxom actress, Ada Isaacs Minkin, was revealed underneath. Now, she's wearing a sheer flesh-colored body stocking. But in the dim lights of theaters of that era, it was impossible to tell whether she was naked or not. So already, this theatrical producer was onto something. Now, the reason that Mazeppa is stripped bare by his enemies is, plot's very convoluted, but they're going to strap him to the back of a horse naked and send him out into the wilderness to be exposed to the elements and to die. Now, traditionally, the way that was represented in the play was they would substitute for the actor a dummy, just a dummy version of the actor. Then they would strap that dummy to the back of a little hobby horse, a little horse on wheels, and someone would roll that horse around the stage 2 or 3 times, a little hobby horse, that kind of represent that, ride out into the element, ride out into the wilderness to be exposed to the elements and to die. Well, none of that for this theatrical producer. He decided he wanted to have a real live horse on stage. So in the climactic scene, Mazeppa's enemies tear off his tunic. The buxom actress Ada Isaacs Minkin is revealed underneath. She's wearing a sheer flesh-colored body stocking. No one can tell whether she's naked or not. Mazeppa's enemies then proceed to strap her, spread-eagled, on her back to the real live horse that proceeds to climb a 4-story high prop that's meant to look like a mountain. So in this, or any era, this is going to be a hit. It made Minkin into one of the great sex symbols of the middle part of the 19th century. And although she's subsequently been forgotten, it made her a big star in the 19th century. So another person who gathered in that little vaulted room, at that long table beneath the Broadway sidewalk, was a man named Fitzhugh Ludlow. And Ludlow was the author of one of the best-selling books of 1857. It was called The Hashish Eater, and it detailed his experiences with the drug as an undergraduate at Union College in Schenectady, New York. Now, this was a time when Americans had very little familiarity with hashish. When it was used at all, it was used in small doses as a medicinal agent for treating conditions like arthritis. As a recreational drug, it was really known in the East, in places like India. But through his vivid Victorian prose, Ludlow introduced Americans to what have really become the classic experiences for anyone who tries hashish or marijuana. Hashish is really just sort of a rarefied, boiled-down version of marijuana. So with his vivid prose, Ludlow described having giggle fits, having music sound really good, becoming ravenously hungry, i.e. the munchies. Now, Ludlow's account was so winning and so well written that actually launched a brief vogue for hashish in the United States. In fact, John Hay, who would later be Lincoln's personal secretary, who later still would be the Secretary of State under McKinley and Theodore Roosevelt, as an undergraduate at Brown University, inspired by Ludlow's book, he sampled the drug, and he would later look back on Brown as a place where he, in quotes, ate hashish and dreamed dreams. So as you can see, this group of people, Ludlow and the others, it's almost as if they were forming a counterculture. Now, that term didn't even exist in the 1850s, but it's an apt description nonetheless. When people think of countercultures, they tend to think of America in the 1960s. But there's so much similarity between America in the 1960s and America in the 1850s. In the 1850s, it was a time of incredible tumult as America hurled headlong towards the Civil War that would break out at the beginning of the next decade in 1861. Now, it's not as if Ludlow or the other figures in the circle, it's not as if they were particularly politically oriented, but it's almost as if the chaos of American society seeped into that little vaulted room and just kind of flowed through them. These were sensitive, artistic types. And it's almost as if the chaos in American society flowed through them and informed their art and their work. Now, the Pfaff's Bohemians, as they're often called, they really represent a transition from art as a genteel profession to art as a soul-deep calling centered on risk-taking and provocation and honesty. And they're really among the first, this group is really among the first in what's become an enduring style of American artist, which is the rebel artist. Of course, the most illustrious person to join the circle was Walt Whitman. And Whitman started hanging out at Pfaff's at a time when he was extremely adrift in his personal and his professional life. He was 39 years old, he was unemployed, he was living at home in Brooklyn, crowded into a basement apartment with his mother and several of his siblings and several of his siblings' children. He hadn't published a poem in 2 years. Being part of this circle gave Whitman an identity as an artist when that identity was very much in question. Being part of the circle also goaded Whitman on. The members of Pfaff's circle, the Pfaff's Bohemians, were very apt at merrymaking, to use a kind of old-fangled term. But by day, at least, these were also very formidable working artists. And they actually treated Faff Saloon, at least in the early part of the evening, almost like a workshop. They would come in and they would share with their fellow Bohemians novels and plays in progress. When I was doing my research, I actually came across examples of people bringing in sculptures and paintings for critique. Artemus Ward, America's first stand-up comic, he actually refined his routine with the frank feedback of his fellow Bohemians before taking it out on the road. So being part of this circle, it really goaded Whitman on. And he was at Pfaff's every single night almost from 1858 to 1862. But as an unemployed person, that left him ample time during the day to work. And this was one of the most productive periods in his career. During the time he was at Pfaff's, he wrote over 100 new poems. Those poems, in turn, formed the core of the landmark 1860 edition of Leaves of Grass. You might call this the Pfaff's edition. This is a vastly expanded edition of the work, much more similar to the one that everybody's familiar with today. And while I was doing my research, I came here to the Library of Congress, where there are some just essential letters related in the Charles Feinberg collection related to the publication of this edition of Leaves of Grass and also to its publication history. Now, this new edition, in what was kind of an enduring pattern for Whitman, it once again visited various bold and controversial themes. There are a number of poems in there about the dissolution of the American Union. The edition came out in 1860, a year before the Civil War, but he was very prescient in seeing how the Union was fragmenting. There are also a number of poems in this new edition about romantic love between men. Now, once again, in what was an enduring pattern for Whitman, this book, it sold very poorly. The critical reception was terrible. What few reviews it received tended to be filled with puzzlement and derision. It really looked like this newest edition was going to sink like a stone, both commercially and critically. At this point, Henry Clapp, the man who had gone to Paris and imported the term Bohemia, the man who sat at the head of that long table, the man sometimes called the King of Bohemians, he came to Whitman's aid. As it happened, Clapp was the editor of a publication called the Saturday Press that during its brief life was one of the most influential journals in America. It was the kind of the mouthpiece of this group of Bohemians. It was filled with items about their romantic dalliances and their drunken exploits. And for a curious America who wanted to know about this strange group of people convening in New York City, it was kind of a must-read. And one of the things I learned in my research was items that appeared first in the Saturday Press were sometimes reprinted in as many as 200 publications around America. So it would appear, something that appeared first in the Saturday Press would appear in Denver and San Francisco and Houston. So it's this kind of magnifier effect for anything that appeared first in the Saturday Press. Well, Henry Clapp chose to commission for the Saturday Press 3 separate reviews of the new edition of Leaves of Grass. He also reprinted the reviews that appeared other places. Now, most of those reviews were negative, so there's something very kind of modern-minded about Clapp, that he would be reprinting these negative reviews. It's kind of like that old saw, all publicity is good publicity. He also commissioned his Whitman's fellow Bohemians from along that table for the Saturday Press to write appreciations of the poet, bits of gossip about him, essays about him, and parodies of his work. The net effect of all this attention in the Saturday Press was it made it seem like Whitman was being buzzed about. And it actually worked its magic. The book actually started to sell. Now, it was never going to be a runaway bestseller, but thanks to Clapp's intervention, he helped set Whitman back on the course, the very slow course, to poetic fame and ultimately to poetic immortality. Now, in 1861, the Civil War broke out, and this scattered the group of Bohemians that gathered at Faff Saloon. Many of them took their acts and peddled them out across the Union states. They'd often reconvene or meet up in various dramatic new settings. Whenever anyone passed back through New York City, they always made a point of visiting their beloved saloon, Pfaff's. Now, in Whitman's case, famously, he came down here to Washington, D.C. and tended to the wounded soldiers in the various hospitals in and around the Capitol. Both of these images, by the way, are from the Library of Congress's collection. The inset portrait of Whitman is a portrait by the great Matthew Brady from this very era. It's from the Civil War era. The other image is of Campbell Hospital, one of the many hospitals where Whitman made his rounds. It's a fantastic picture. It's just incredibly clear, and you can actually really see a lot of detail about the various men gathered in this ward. Now, another item that the Library of Congress has in its collection that relates to this particular era for Whitman is his haversack, his leather haversack. Now, when he visited, one of the many things he did when he visited these hospitals was he would take orders from the soldiers, the wounded soldiers, about things that they needed. And these were very modest wishes. They might want a peach or some horehound candy or a little bit of raspberry syrup to soothe their aching sore throat. So he'd fill up his leather haversack with these items and sort of make the rounds and dole them out. That leather haversack it's in the collection. It's one of the treasures in the library's collection. It was actually on display for a year or so, about a year ago. And sadly, I wasn't down here at the time, and I never got to see the real item for myself. Now, in April of 1865, the Civil War ended. And we've just a week or so ago celebrated the sesquicentennial of that event. Less than 1 week after the Civil War ended, Abraham Lincoln was assassinated. And it's almost as if the blackness, the darkness from that event, it's almost as if it was a virus that spread out and infected the various members of the Pfaff circle. Within a matter of sometimes as little as months, sometimes just a few years of Lincoln's assassination, almost everybody in this circle had fallen into obscurity. They'd had their zeitgeist moment on the eve of the Civil War, hanging out at Faff Saloon, and now they fell on hard times. In fact, many of these people, many of the very people I was talking about, would die young, often under tragic circumstances. Whitman, of course, was one of the few who lived on into old age. And he would almost be like a witness to this long-lost scene at Faff Saloon. In fact, late in life, he would say to one of his first biographers, he'd say, "Pfaff's Bohemia has never been reported, and more the sorrow." Now, as Whitman grew older, he became a very renowned and much photographed figure in late 19th century life. He just looks the way you'd want a poet to look. He's got the shaggy beard and the shaggy hair and the twinkling, wise gray eyes. But here's the thing about Whitman. As he aged, as so often happens with artists, his powers as a poet almost entirely abandoned him. He continued to write poetry, but it suffers so much in comparison to his earlier work. So if you have a favorite Whitman poem, chances are it's the work of a younger man, possibly even the work of the young Bohemian Whitman. So I'm going to close today by reading a brief excerpt from one of my favorite Whitman poems, and what I think is one of his finest poems, called Crossing Brooklyn Ferry. Now, this is a poem that makes use of a very frequent or common Whitman literary device that I like to call the universal I. This is an I, or a first person, that sometimes can be taken to be the poet himself, but sometimes it can be taken to be a kind of vague cosmic representation of him. And Whitman used this universal I in a very bold way. He would write poems in the first person addressing future readers. It's a bold thing to presume that people are going to be reading you far off in the future, perhaps after you're dead. But there's a reason we remember Whitman among all the people in this group of Bohemians. He was a towering talent. On his best days, he knew that. And on his best days, he would actually sometimes write poems in the first person addressing future readers. And he was onto something, because here it is more than 100 years after his death, and we're still reading these poems in the first person addressed to us. So in this case, I'm going to read a brief excerpt from Crossing Brooklyn Ferry, and the action of the poem, as it were, is Whitman, or a vague cosmic representation of him, is traveling by ferry from Brooklyn to Manhattan, and along the way meditating about how all the feelings and emotions he's having will be shared by people in the future. So I've got my bag of tricks here. I'm going to put on my Whitman hat. Hopefully it creates a useful illusion. Hopefully it's not like that little hobby horse that was dragged around circles in Mazeppa. And get out my very much not original first edition of Leaves of Grass. This is at best a facsimile version of it that I got for about $8. And without further ado, I'll read a brief excerpt from Crossing Brooklyn Ferry. Flood tide below me, I watch you face to face. Clouds of the west, sun there half an hour high, I see you also face to face. Crowds of men and women attired in the usual costumes, how curious you are to me. On the ferry boats, the hundreds and hundreds that cross, returning home, are more curious to me than you suppose. And you that cross from shore to shore years hence are more to me, and more in my meditations than you might suppose. Others will enter the gates of the ferry, and cross from shore to shore. Others will watch the run of the flood tide. Others will see the shipping of Manhattan north and west, and the heights of Brooklyn to the south and east. Others will see the islands large and small. 50 years hence, others will see them as they cross, the sun half an hour high. 100 years hence, or ever so many 100 years hence, others will see them, will enjoy the sunset, the pouring in of the flood tide, the falling back to the sea of the ebb tide. It avails not, neither time or place. Distance avails not. I am with you, you men and women of a generation, or ever so many generations hence. I project myself, also I return. I am with you, and know how it is. Just as you feel when you look on the river and sky, so I felt. Just as any of you is one of a living crowd, I was one of a crowd. Just as you were refreshed by the gladness of the river and the bright flow, I was refreshed. Just as you stand and lean on the rail, yet hurry with the swift current, I stood, yet was hurried. These and all else were to me the same as they are to you. I project myself a moment to tell you, also I return. It is not you alone who knows what it is to be evil. I am he who knew what it was to be evil. I too knitted the old knot of contrariety, blabbed, blushed, resented, lied, stole, grudged, had guile, anger, lust, hot wishes I dared not speak, was wayward, vain, greedy, shallow, sly, cowardly, malignant. The wolf, the snake, the hog, not wanting in me. The cheating look, the frivolous word, the adulterous wish, not wanting. Refusals, hates, postponements, meanness, laziness, none of these wanting. But I was Manhattanese, friendly and proud. I was called by my nighest name, by the loud voices of young men as they saw me approaching or passing, felt their arms on my neck as I stood, or the negligent leaning of their flesh against me as I sat, saw many I loved in the street, or ferry boat, or public assembly. The men and women I saw were all near to me, others the same, others who look back on me because I look forward to them. The time will come, though I stop here today and tonight. What is it, then, between us? What is the count of the scores or hundreds of years between us? Whatever it is, it avails not. Distance avails not, and place avails not. I, too, lived. Brooklyn of ample hills was mine. I, too, walked the streets of Manhattan Island and bathed in the waters around it. I, too, felt the curious, abrupt questionings stir within me. In the day, among crowds of people, sometimes they came upon me. In my walks home late at night, or as I lay in my bed, they came upon me. Closer yet, I approach you. What thoughts you had of me, I had as much of you. I laid in my stores in advance. I considered long and seriously of you before you were born. Who is to know what should come home to me? Who knows but I am enjoying this? Who knows but I am as good as looking at you now, for all you cannot see me? It is not you alone, nor I alone, not a few races, nor a few generations, nor a few centuries. It is that each came, or comes, or shall come from its due emission. From the general center of all, and forming a part of all, everything indicates, the smallest does, and the largest does. A necessary film envelops all, and envelops the soul for a proper time. Thank you. Thank you. And if anybody has any questions, yes, sir.
I was wondering, there's a kind of second Bohemia that flourished in New York and Greenwich Village in pre-1914 that assembled in Polly's restaurant and read the masses and went to Provincetown players and then Gina Neal. And I was wondering if there was any connection. Did they have any conscious sense of being sort of descendants of this first Bohemia?
Sure. The question is whether the Bohemia that gathered, sort of, you might call it the second wave of American Bohemia that gathered in Greenwich Village around the World War I, whether they had any kind of conscious awareness or emulation of the group at Pfaff's. And the answer is Pfaff's was actually, it was kind of lost in history, and precious few people really had any familiarity. Interestingly, the beatniks out in San Francisco had some familiarity with Pfaff's for whatever reason. And Allen Ginsberg actually was familiar with Pfaff's and actually made references to it in his letters and poems. However, so many other what seemed like almost seemed so resonant. Everything from the Algonquin Round Table, who weren't Bohemians, of course, but they were gathering at a long table, or the group you refer to, didn't really have any. Pfaff's had been lost in history, literally. Whitman was remembered, but he wasn't remembered as a member of Faff Saloon or as this group of Bohemians. The rest of the number were forgotten. The bar was long closed. And so what you really have, of course, is Greenwich Village, until recently when the rents got too high, was a Bohemian enclave for all the classic reasons of other Bohemian enclaves, because it was, it was a place where, where it was relatively cheap to live, and there was a tradition of artists and people who considered themselves different gathering there. And so that's what accounts literally for the reason Pfaff's was where it was because that was the kind of environment that prevailed there in the 1850s, and that environment continued to prevail there through the 20th century. And so that first group of that second group of Bohemians, or second wave, you might call them, around the World War I era, although they were in the same place and drawn from many of the same reasons and had many of the same values and style, they were, as far as I know, pretty unaware of Pfaff's that came before them. Yes?
Let me ask you something. A few questions. Obviously, this group of people coming together, of a kind of a very mixed background. Was there any kind of, because of what you're doing, Walt Whitman, and all of these other people, was there any resistance, because you didn't talk about that, was there any resistance against these people? Was there any pushback against what they were doing? Did people feel that, they were moving in too much of a rebellious direction that was causing greater problems in America? That's the first question. The second question about seeing these people as a kind of American version of romantics, right? Do you see anything in that? Do you believe that they were influenced by the ideas of romanticism, or do you believe they were much more in a critical kind of Enlightenment view of the arts? How do you see that? Or do you see it as a mixture again, that they had elements of both of these parts? Because obviously the poem you read talks about him. He captures the complexity and the ambiguity and the power of the United States of America in many different ways, right? But you can see that for certain people, that might not be something that they want to engage with at that point in time, obviously against the coming up of the society. So what do you think about these?
Sure, I'll take those questions each in turn. The first one being, was there any kind of pushback against this very radical group of people? And there absolutely was, in so many different ways. And I'll discuss briefly two areas. One was, so you might imagine, this Pfaff group of Bohemians, it almost reminds me of any of the movements from our lifetime that are sort of radical, and people start to notice them and they write articles about them. They're critical of this strange group of people that's trying to bring a new idea to art or whatever it might be. And there's a lot of, with the Pfaff Bohemians, because they were gathered in a discreet place, the saloon, other publications, other mainstream publications started dispatching intrepid reporters to report on their scandalous behavior, and in the New York Times and other more more conservative establishment publications, they dispatched people into this vaulted room, and I always picture them kind of standing on the periphery, being kind of uncool, writing some, and they'd often make a lot of notes about how hirsute the men were and that there were women among them and so forth. And as you might imagine, I have no doubt that these particular dispatches did the same thing they do today. They glamorized this group of people. They made them seem, to certain people, it was a sign, there's some scandalous elements among us. To other, I'm sure, young people and so forth, they're like, wow, this, a bunch of crazy bearded artists women and men mixed together. How do I get the Pfaff? So yeah, there was definitely, and then the second, much more distinct kind of, you might call it resistance, was when Whitman wrote that first edition of Leaves of Grass, it didn't make much of a ripple except with one incredibly important person, Ralph Waldo Emerson. And Ralph Waldo Emerson said that he detected a genuine American voice, a real, someone who'd broken away from Europe and sort of being in Europe's sway, a real American voice. And he was Whitman's first champion. And I like to think, it's a revisionist view, but I like to think of Emerson, who was Whitman's first champion, and Clapp, the head of the Bohemians, sitting on Whitman's shoulder, almost like the devil and an angel. And you know who the devil is? It's Clapp, obviously. Well, when Whitman published that third edition of Leaves of Grass, that critical edition, he actually went up to Boston. It was going to have a commercial publisher called Thayer and Eldridge up in Boston. Whitman went up there. When Emerson learned that Whitman was in his midst, he thought one final opportunity to get Whitman back onto the straight and narrow path. And so he spent 2 hours walking around the Boston Common trying to convince Whitman to expurgate the book, to remove those poems about romantic love between men and other erotic and other challenging poems. Emerson worked very hard to try to convince Whitman. Whitman, I picture, and meanwhile, Clapp was writing Whitman letters while he was in Boston saying, we miss you at Pfaff's, please hurry back and so forth. Well, Whitman made the decision, I feel like in part because of Devil Clapp on his shoulder, to leave the book unexpurgated, to publish those risque poems. And a good argument can be made that had he kind of denatured the book and had it been a more safe book, it wouldn't have created the controversy that lived with that book, at least through the first years of its existence, which helped make it a controversial, a much sought after, and also a kind of a risque work. So yeah, there was definitely pushback. Then to quickly answer your second question, which related to were the people in this circle, were they drawing on the work of the Romantics? And I would say they made an effort with Clapp as their leader to create a clean break, in their own way, what Emerson wanted, but but in a different way. They were the birth of sort of rebel art. Their timing was perfect because in the 1850s, it was a time of terrible cynicism. I mean, you had two of the worst U.S. presidents right in a row, Franklin Pierce and James Buchanan. You had the worst Supreme Court case of all time, probably, with the Dred Scott decision in the 1850s. There was a sense that American society was in dissolution. And so the people who gathered at Faff Saloon, their natural stock in trade was edginess, parody, thumbing their nose at authority, writing in Whitman's case poems about an orientation that wasn't a mainstream orientation that people would be uncomfortable with. In the case of other people, in the case of Artemus Ward, comedy, which is always, dangerous and risque by its natural terms. So although these people were familiar with the Romantics, and in Whitman's case particularly, you can certainly find lots of evidence of how he was influenced by Wordsworth and others. Their intentions, at least, were to make a clean break from what came back before them, and in this kind of tumultuous 1850s environment, to thumb their nose at the establishment, basically. Yes?
It may be coincidental, but you mentioned, it seems to me, at least three Bohemian periods, this one and then the second in 1914 and the third in the 60s. And each of those also is accompanied by a major civil rights movement, if you will, abolition, suffrage, women's suffrage, and then the civil rights movement itself. Was there a real connection, in fact? Did these people have an awareness of abolition as part of their program, or? It's
so interesting you said that. I didn't get into it in my speech because it's too complex to get into it. But what was really, and I should mention first, his question was there a connection between the circle at Pfaff's and some of the social movements happening in America at that time, such as abolitionism and temperance and so forth? This was distinct from, say, you could certainly say Vietnam, that era, concerns about the Vietnam War, other social issues gave rise to socially conscious artist movements and so forth. This particular movement was very different because it was driven by Henry Clapp, and Henry Clapp had actually, as a young man in Boston, he'd been an abolitionist. He'd also been a advocate for women's suffrage in the 1840s. I mean, we're talking, 80 years before the 19th Amendment was passed. So he was very steeped in various social issues. But when he went over to Paris, he felt like he'd been raised a Congregationalist, and the Congregationalists, of course, are the inheritors of the Puritan tradition. So he'd been raised in a very strict environment, been involved in these very lofty social issues. He goes to Paris, and it's just it changes his whole mind. He starts drinking, and he becomes a libertine, basically. He decides to go back to New York City instead of going back to New England. He decides to found a movement that is self-consciously about art and decadence, and is actually, unlike the 1960s in America, is actually ignoring, although it's fueled through some of the same impulses, the sense that American society is breaking up. In their case, they meet the breakup of American society, the tensions of American society, they meet them with satire and cynicism, and actually consciously are distanced from the members of this. I mean, a lot of people passed through the saloon, so I'm sure there were some who had some political involvement about issues like abolitionism and so forth, but the prevailing spirit of this group was a kind of apolitical, let's fiddle while Rome burns type of movement. So
more about the self than about society. I certainly see that in Whitman.
Mm-hmm. Very much. Yes.
Over 4 decades ago, I practically lived at the Bleecker Street Cinema. So you got to tell me, was Pfaff's on the east side or the west side of Broadway?
He asked if Pfaff's on the east side or west side. I'll gladly tell you, west side, right? And it's on the west side, and it's there's a shoe store there now.
Right.
Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
Okay. Did William Lloyd Garrison or Frederick Douglass ever visit Pfaff's? And did Clapp ever meet Baudelaire in France?
Great questions all around. Did Clapp ever meet Baudelaire? Not that I know of. Frederick Douglass and William Lloyd Garrison certainly never visited Pfaff's to my knowledge. However, I'll tell you an interesting thing. Clapp was one of the many people who hit about very, very, I mean, he was the person with the most invested in this. He was also the oldest. He was older than many of his young cohorts. And so he wasn't in a position when the Saturday Press, that his great mouthpiece, failed. And because he'd already been exposed to the whiskey while in Paris, he started hitting the whiskey hard, and he went downhill very fast. And came to a very sad end, going to various asylums. And from one of those asylums, back in the 1840s, when he was a well-known lecturer on abolitionism, he'd shared the stage with Frederick Douglass. He wrote an absolutely pathetic letter from an asylum asking Frederick Douglass if he could borrow $5. And Frederick Douglass did in fact send him $5 and made a comment in a different letter to someone else in which he said, I remember Clapp was once a noble, and I can't remember the exact wording, but something like, Clapp was once a useful and noble voice for abolitionism. He seems to have fallen on hard times, so I've sent him $5, and hopefully that'll help. It didn't help much, but yes.
The library's press release here about your book says that both Edwin Booth and Mark Twain had connections with the Bohemians. Could you comment on that?
I'd be glad to. Yeah, I'd like to think it's such a, there's so many threads to the story that there's only somebody I could pick up in the speech. But your question about I'll tell you about each of those connections. Edwin Booth was, you might call him a friend of Pfaff. Strangely, Edwin Booth was at the time of Faff Saloon, he was a terrible alcoholic. Yet I could find no evidence. I worked very hard and solicited advice from some very knowledgeable Booth scholars. They said there's no evidence that he ever set foot in Faff Saloon, but you might call him a friend of Pfaff's. And it was the friendship with Pfaff's went much deeper than, just being somebody. I mean, he knew the members of this circle so very well. Fitzhugh Ludlow, the hashish eater, was very close friends with him. Also, Henry Clapp, he would devote about half of every issue of the Saturday Press to Whitman, to singing his praises and trying to raise him up. He'd devote the other half to talking about Edwin Booth and saying, was his latest Hamlet as good as his last one? Is he on his way to being the great artist he's meant to be? So I included a lot of discussion of Booth in the book because he interwove with this group of people, even though, as I said, I could never place him physically at Pfaff's, and I thought it was important to make that distinction. As for Mark Twain, different, really interesting connection. When Artemus, I described how during the Civil War, the artists from Pfaff's peddled their acts out through the Union states, except for Ada Isaacs Minkin, who actually would go down into the southern states and actually would put a picture of Robert E. Lee on her mirror and pretend to be from the southern sympathizer. Then she'd go back up north and put a picture of Lincoln on her mirror. She was very brazen, but the rest of them confined their acts to the Union states. And so Artemus Ward, America's first stand-up comic, as you might imagine, the outbreak of the Civil War, you'd think it would be a bad thing for an entertainer, but people were desperate for entertainment on the home front, as it were. And so his comedy act was very well met. He traveled out west, and in Virginia City, Nevada, he met up with a young comic writer, Mark Twain. Mark Twain had only changed he met up with Mark Twain in the summer of 1863. Twain had only just changed his name, adopted his nom de plume only a few months earlier. He and Artemus Ward made fast friends. And as often happens in situations like this, Mark Twain was still a fairly unknown, he had a regional reputation based on the paper he worked for, which was called the Virginia Territorial Reporter, Virginia City Territorial Reporter, but he wasn't known other places. Well, Artemus Ward promised, he said, I know a lot of editors, Artemus Ward was, Lincoln was a fan, he'd published books of his comedy routines and so forth. He said, I know editors back east, if you send me a story, I'll see to it that it's published back east by one of the people I knew. Well, the story that Twain sent to Artemus Ward was called Jim Smiley and His Jumping Frog. He handed it to Henry Clapp, who published the Saturday Press. Henry Clapp published that story, which was later retitled, of course, The Celebrated Jumping Frog of Calaveras County. And that was the story that broke, because the Saturday Press had such a big reach, that story actually broke Twain to a national audience. And he was always very appreciative. He said later in life, he said something to the effect of, I was in a chrysalis and the Saturday Press is what released me as a butterfly, or something to that effect. So that connection between Artemus Ward, the stand-up comedian, and Mark Twain and Henry Clapp, who published that, his breakthrough work, Celebrated Jumping Frog, in the Saturday Press, that's the Twain connection. Any other questions? Well, thank you very much. I enjoyed this.
Thank you, Justin.
Oh, thank you. I enjoyed it.
Justin, that was terrific.
Thank
You
you.
really brought us into the story and into the characters, and it was just a great American history, American studies presentation that of a pretty much unknown period. And I loved how you linked it to these other periods of our history. So congratulations on the book, and we're having a book signing out back, and one more round of applause for Justin Martin.
Thanks, Tom. Thank you.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.